But let's look through this and see what we can come together with. One of the first things to think about is that in John's new commission, right, he starts off his commission as a prophet. Now he is evidently a builder or an architect or somebody in charge of measuring things. He is given a rod or a reed or staff, depending on your translation, that he's to use to measure. So small, lightweight, hollow reed that is measuring, used to measure stuff. In this case, the temple. As a background for this is Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48. In Ezekiel 40 through 48, Ezekiel sees a man measuring the temple with a rod. Right? And so it's the kind of the exact same type of thing. And if we had time to go through chapters 40 and 48, you would find that there is very intricate detail in those chapters about, the alcoves and the columns and the courts and how, it goes through very intricate detail how long each of these things are. Not so much in Revelation. We don't really get any measurements of this temple in chapter 11 as far as what's it turn out to be? What's the measurement? And scholars suggest that in Ezekiel's vision, where he sees this grand temple, to indicate God's ownership and protection of his people. And so that's what Ezekiel is about, is that here is this group of people in captivity. And so the fact that Ezekiel sees someone measuring the temple suggests that God has not forgotten his people in captivity. He's not forgotten them in exile. He continues to protect them. They're continually his people. And so that's the focus. Now there are some people, futurists, that believe that this prophecy in Ezekiel 40 through 48 is still left to be fulfilled. Because when you look through that prophecy, there has never been a temple like that built in Jerusalem. Certainly, the time Ezekiel is prophesying, there is no temple in Jerusalem because it's been destroyed by the Babylonians. And the second temple that is rebuilt at the end of exile never looked anything like what's described in Ezekiel. And even after Herod the Great renovated the temple, it still did not look like that. And so some people believe that's what it's talking about, is a future temple that is still to be built, instead of this symbolic temple, which would fit more with the vision. Furthermore, in thinking about John's activity, right? So he's told to come and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. And so it's kind of like he's got three things he's measuring. It kind of seems like there's three different components there. And so we have this temple imagery. And so given that he's talking about measuring the temple, what temple is he talking about would be the question. For a lot of preterists that take the Jewish view that has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem, what temple would he be talking about? Well, he'd be talking about the second temple, the temple that existed at the time of Jesus. But if he's not talking about that Jewish temple, what could he possibly be talking about? Right? So we have the one option is there's a temple to be built in the future. One is it's talking about the Jewish temple. What other temples could we possibly think that would fit into this idea of measuring the temple?
Where it is, there's some grace that says like the Christian body is so be the church.
Right. In 1 Corinthians, in two places in 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 3 and 1 Corinthians 6, Paul refers to the body as the temple of the Holy Spirit. In chapter 3, he's referring to the body, the church, as the Holy Spirit, as the temple of the Holy Spirit. In 1 Corinthians 6, he's talking about your individual body. Right? And so both your individual body and the collective body of the church are each a temple of the Holy Spirit. And so that would be an additional option here, is that when he says temple, he means church. Also, in John chapter 2, when Jesus cleanses the temple, there's the discussion from the others about, what are you doing, kicking everybody and the money changers out of here? And Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rebuild it. And of course the Jews that are there listening think he's talking about Herod's temple. But John tells us he's talking about the temple of his body. So we have 4 options here. A temple that's going to be rebuilt in the future, the Jerusalem temple, the church, or something to do with Jesus' body. Now, Jesus' physical body and his resurrection doesn't seem to be the likely one here. That just doesn't seem to fit with the rest of what's going on. So we can probably rule that one out. Also, we've been tending to take the late date for the writing of Revelation. Now, if you disagree with me, and that's understandable, but in general, the way we've been presenting it, the way we've been talking about it in class, is the late date, which means the temple's already been destroyed. So it doesn't make sense to measure the physical, temple in Jerusalem. It doesn't exist. So our options are the futurist temple or the church. And so in that sense, what we see are a couple of things. In both cases, whether we think of it as something futurist or we think of it more of something related to that first century audience, there are a couple of things to consider. Right? In the temple courts, which John is drawing from, right, and talking about measuring the temple, the altar, the people who dwell there, who worship there, he's wanting his hearers to think back to that temple. In the temple area, there was the temple proper, right? The holy place, the most holy place, the actual temple itself. And then after that, there were a series of courts, right? Areas where only certain people could go into. And so outside the temple proper was the court of the priests. And it was kind of cordoned off by walls. And so you could only go in that area if you were a priest. Outside of the court of the priests was the court of the Israelites. Now, the court of the Israelites really meant the court of the Israelite men. And so if you were an Israelite man, you could be in that court. Outside of that was the court of the women. Then outside of that was the court of the Gentiles, or the court of the nations. And so depending on who you were, you could go so far towards the temple, right, where God dwells, and you could get variously close. In fact, plaques have been archaeologically excavated from that wall between the court of the Gentiles and the court of the women that said that Gentiles passed that point on pain of death. Right? That, if you were a Gentile and passed into the court of the women or the court of the Israelites, you could be executed. Right? So it was very serious about who could get so close to God and who was in that relationship with God. And so there's kind of that being kind of evoked by saying, these outer courts, right? The courts outside. That's what's kind of being the image there. Ultimately here, whether we take a futurist view or a more modified preterist view, what we're thinking of here is measuring spiritually the people, right? Because I think here that if you're a futurist, you should take the more spiritual view. Right? Maybe someday a temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem. Highly unlikely. Right? I don't think if we have more time we could look at some other passages. I don't think that's a promise still on the books, waiting for this to take place. I think instead we should take this in a more symbolic way in the context of the church. So what's the purpose of measuring the temple if it refers to the church, whether church past or church present? Future. What's the point of John measuring the temple?
To see if it meets standards.
Okay, in one sense we could think that there's something here with a standard, right? Because in order to be able to know what the measurement is, you have to have a standard. Right? If you're going to measure in feet, you have to know what a foot is. Right? And so by using this measuring rod, there's a standard. So maybe there's a kind of a, does it meet up to the standards? What else or what other things might be suggested by saying measuring the temple? Okay. We've talked about, in chapter 10 about, the time coming, there's no more delay. We've talked about so the sealing of 144,000 was going to take place before some other things, right? So this idea of the time being ready. The other thing that I could think of that might fit into this as well is that measuring in the sense of protection, right? And so by measuring, you know the dimensions, right? So you know what is the temple. So maybe it's kind of like the sealing of 144,000 in that it's a measure of protection. But it might not be a complete protection. Because John is told there's a part of the temple area he's not to measure. And that's the court outside. And so he's to measure the temple, the altar, and those who worship there. And he's to measure that, but not that outside court. And the reason he's not to measure that outside court is that it has been given over to the nations. Now the word nation there could also be translated Gentiles. And maybe, depending on your translation, it might actually have Gentiles. So, what's behind this, of course, is that idea of the court of the Gentiles, that area that's kind of outside where outsiders could come. So what's this all about? In not measuring the court outside, it is kind of excluded from that first part. So what's going on here? What is being excluded? Now, if we understand the church or the temple here is some manifestation of the church, right? It's kind of a spiritual image for Christians. What's outside the courts that could be trampled on? Right? I mean, in a sense here, what's going to take place is that the courts have been given over to the Gentiles for them to trample over. Now, if this is some sort of judgment on the persecutor, it doesn't kind of really make sense. Right? The persecutors are going to persecute other persecutors. That doesn't kind of make sense. So what's going on? Maybe the courts outside are a physical representation of the church in contrast to the heavenly temple. And so what we're seeing here is that the temple that's being measured is a heavenly representation of the church, and the courts outside are some sort of physical representation. That we're talking about those Christians that are living. There is still the notion of protection. God measures the temple. He knows heavenly who's there. But God is going to allow some persecution to take place. The nations will trample. And the word that's translated there in the New Revised Standard as trample suggests the idea of kind of a victorious army swarming over a conquered city. Right? There's no concern for making sure everything is safe and structurally sound. The army just comes in and there's all sort of destructive activity. There's abuses, mistreatment. That's the image that John is using. They're going to trample over the holy city. What's the holy city? I mean, we immediately think Jerusalem, right? Because we think about, the Old Testament. We're talking about the temple. Where was the temple located? It was located in Jerusalem. But again, probably not literal Jerusalem, but instead symbolically New Jerusalem, like we'll see in chapters 21 and 22. So again, probably holy city and the courts outside are probably the same kind of symbol.
Earlier in Revelation, whenever he was talking to the seven different churches, didn't he say that there would be New Jerusalem?
Yes, so he talks about, having a place in the New Jerusalem. Yeah, absolutely. And in chapters 21 and 22, we'll see that, and we'll talk about what that's like. And so by the fact of calling it the holy city, I think he's talking about this idea of symbolically the church, the New Jerusalem here as well.